The October morning mist clung to the mountainside like a shroud, and Cornelius Brixton could taste the familiar bite of autumn air as he saddled Maverick for their annual ride. For 17 years, they had traveled the same winding trail through the Cascade foothills, a sacred ritual that marked the anniversary of his father's death. The path wound through dense timber, across crystal streams, and up to the old fire tower where his father had once worked as a lookout. It was their pilgrimage, his and Maverick's, a journey of remembrance that neither time nor weather had ever interrupted. Maverick snorted softly as Cornelius adjusted the stirrups, the stallion's breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. The horse was getting on in years, his once coal-black coat now touched with silver round the muzzle, but his spirit remained as strong as the day Cornelius had rescued him from a neglectful owner. They understood each other in the way that only comes from countless hours shared in saddle and stable, through storms and sunshine, triumph and heartbreak. The first mile passed as it always did, Maverick's hooves finding their rhythm on the familiar dirt path, fallen leaves crunching beneath them in a gentle percussion. Cornelius let his mind wander to memories of his father, Jasper Brixton, a man who had loved these mountains with a fierce devotion. Jasper had taught him to read the land like a book, how to spot the subtle signs of changing weather in the movement of clouds, how to find water by following the flight patterns of birds, how to respect the wilderness that could shelter or destroy depending on one's wisdom. They passed the old mining claim where rusted equipment still lay scattered among the undergrowth, testimony to dreams long abandoned. They crossed Willow Creek, at the narrow ford where Cornelius had once fallen in as a boy, earning a rare laugh from his usually stoic father. Each landmark held its place in their annual ritual, waypoints on a map of memory that stretched back through nearly 2 decades of solitary rides. But as they approached the 3-mile marker, a towering Douglas fir that had been struck by lightning years ago, leaving a distinctive scar down its trunk, Maverick suddenly stopped. His ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as he tested the air. Cornelius felt the horse's muscles tense beneath him, every fiber of the animals being focused on something ahead that remained invisible to human senses. "What is it, boy?" Cornelius murmured, leaning forward to stroke Maverick's neck. The horse trembled slightly, a fine vibration that spoke of deep unease. For several minutes they remained motionless, Cornelius scanning the trail ahead for any sign of danger, a bear, perhaps, or a mountain lion. But the forest seemed peaceful, bathed in the golden light filtering through the canopy above. When Cornelius urged Maverick forward with a gentle squeeze of his legs, the horse took to reluctant steps, then stopped again. This time, his refusal was absolute. Every line of his body spoke of an unwillingness to continue, a fear so profound that it overrode 17 years of trust and training. Cornelius had never seen his horse react this way to anything. The scarred Douglas fir stood, perhaps 50 yards ahead, marking the boundary of something Maverick could sense, but Cornelius could not. Whatever lay beyond that point had transformed their sacred ritual into something else entirely, a mystery that would challenge everything Cornelius thought he knew about the trail, his horse, and the mountains his father had loved. Cornelius dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the soft earth with a muffled thud. Maverick's fear was palpable now, radiating from the horse in waves that made the air itself seem thick and oppressive. In all their years together, through thunderstorms that split the sky and encounters with wildlife that would spook most horses, Maverick had never shown such profound terror. The stallion's eyes were wide, whites showing, and a fine sheen of sweat had broken out across his neck despite the cool morning air. "Easy, boy, easy now." Cornelius kept his voice low and steady, the same tone he had used to gentle countless frightened animals over the years. He moved to Maverick's head, placing a firm hand on the horse's muzzle. The animal's nostrils fluttered against his palm, hot breath warming his fingers as Maverick sought comfort in familiar touch. Leading the horse by the reins, Cornelius took a cautious step toward the scarred Douglas fir. Maverick planted his hooves and refused to budge, pulling backward with enough force to nearly drag Cornelius off his feet. The horse's normally gentle demeanor had transformed into something primal and desperate, the kind of fear that came from deep instinct rather than learned behavior. Cornelius studied the trail ahead with new intensity. The scarred tree stood like a sentinel. Its lightning-carved wound a pale streak against the dark bark. Beyond it, the path curved slightly. To the left, disappearing behind a cluster of younger pines. Nothing appeared out of place. Yet something had changed. The very quality of light seemed different somehow, filtered through leaves that cast shadows in patterns his eyes couldn't quite interpret. He tried to remember previous year's rides, searching his memory for any detail he might have overlooked. Had there always been that fallen log beside the trail? Had the underbrush always grown so thick on the right side of the path? The landscape felt familiar yet foreign, like a favorite song played in a different key. A raven called from somewhere in the canopy above, its harsh cry echoing through the forest. Maverick's ears swiveled toward the sound, and for a moment his trembling intensified. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the bird's call ceased, leaving behind a silence that seemed deeper than mere absence of sound. Cornelius found himself holding his breath, straining to hear what Maverick's sharper senses had already detected. Was that the whisper of wind through branches, or something else entirely? The soft percussion of settling leaves, or footsteps moving carefully through the undergrowth? His rational mind dismissed such thoughts as products of imagination and his horse's contagious anxiety. But 17 years of partnership had taught him to trust Maverick's instincts over his own limited perceptions. He made a decision, leaving Maverick ground-tied well back from the source of his fear. Cornelius approached the scarred tree alone. Each step forward felt like moving through invisible resistance, as if the air itself had thickened. The sensation was so subtle, he might have attributed it to nerves, but Maverick's unwavering gaze tracked his progress with the intensity of a sentinel, watching over a battlefield dot as he drew closer to the lightning-scarred Douglas fir. Cornelius noticed details that had escaped his attention during previous year's rides. The scar wasn't just a simple wound, it spiraled around the trunk in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, like some ancient marking carved by careful hands rather than nature's random violence. The bark around the wound had healed in strange formations, creating ridges and valleys that resembled symbols or letters in an alphabet he couldn't decipher. Behind him, Maverick whinnied softly, a sound that carried both warning and plea. Cornelius paused with his hand extended toward the scarred bark, suddenly aware that touching the tree might cross some invisible threshold from which there would be no return. The morning mist had thickened around the base of the fir, swirling in patterns that defied the gentle breeze moving through the rest of the forest. Something was wrong with this place, had perhaps always been wrong, though he had been blind to it during his previous pilgrimages. The question now was whether he had the courage to discover what his horse's ancient wisdom had always known. Cornelius pulled his hand back from the scarred bark, his father's voice echoing across the years. When an animal shows fear, boy, you'd best listen. They know things we've forgotten how to hear. Jasper Brixton had been a man of few words, but every one carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Standing in the swirling mist, Cornelius finally understood why his father had always insisted on walking this particular section of trail rather than riding through it. The memory came flooding back, 17 years suppressed, now crystal clear. On their last ride together before his father's fatal heart attack, they had dismounted at this very spot. Jasper's old mare, Delilah, had shown the same reluctance that now gripped Maverick. But Cornelius had been 22 then, impatient with what he saw as his father's superstitions, eager to reach the fire tower before the weather turned. "Why do we always stop here, Dad?" he had asked, watching Jasper study the scarred tree with an expression that bordered on reverence. "Some places hold more than earth and wood," his father had replied, running weathered fingers along the spiral scar. "This old fir has been a marker long before either of us was born. The Yakama people called it the threshold tree, said it marked the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of spirits." Young Cornelius had scoffed at the notion, dismissing it as folklore. But now, watching mist coil around the base of the ancient Douglas fir in patterns that seemed almost purposeful, he felt his skepticism crumble. Maverick's fear suddenly made perfect sense. The horse was responding to something that existed beyond the range of human perception, something his father had been trying to teach him to respect. The mist grew thicker, and within its swirling depths, Cornelius began to see shapes that shouldn't exist. Shadows moved independent of any visible form casting them. Faces seemed to form and dissolve in the vapor, features too indistinct to identify yet somehow familiar. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the October air. He turned back toward Maverick, intending to retreat, but found his path blocked by a figure emerging from the mist. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought he was seeing his father, the same tall, lean build, the same confident stride, but as the figure drew closer, details resolved that didn't match his memory. This man was younger, dressed in clothing from an earlier era, and his eyes held a sadness that seemed to encompass decades of unfinished business. "You came back," the stranger said, his voice carrying the hollow echo of wind through empty spaces. "Every year, you've come back, but you never see us." Cornelius's mouth went dry. Who are you?" "I was called Ezekiel Thornfield in life," the figure replied, his form flickering like candlelight in a draft. "I died on this trail 63 years ago, crushed when that Douglas fir fell across the path during a winter storm. The tree lived, grew back stronger, but I remained." More shapes began to emerge from the mist, men and women from different eras, their clothing spanning decades. Some wore the practical garb of loggers and miners, others the simple dresses and work shirts of homesteaders. All shared the same expression of profound longing, as if they were waiting for something that had been delayed far too long. "We've been trying to reach you," Ezekiel continued. "Every year when you pass through, we call out, but the living world has grown deaf to our voices. Only the animals still hear us clearly. Your horse knows we mean no harm, he fears for you. Not of us." That double quotes. Cornelius found his voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "What do you want?" "What all the departed want," Ezekiel replied, his form solidifying as the mist swirled around him. "To be remembered, to have our stories told, to know that our lives mattered beyond the brief span we walked this earth." Behind Cornelius, Maverick whinnied again, but the sound now carried a different tone, not fear, but recognition. The horse had always known this place was special, had always sensed the presence of those who lingered here. It was Cornelius who had been blind, too caught up in his own grief to recognize the community of sorrow that gathered at the threshold tree each October, waiting for someone to acknowledge their existence. The mist continued to thicken, and with it came more figures, a growing assembly of souls who had found their final rest. Along this mountain trail, Cornelius watched in fascination rather than fear as they materialized, each one carrying the story of their passing written in the details of their appearance. A woman in a faded calico dress clutched a bundle that might have been a child. A man in logger's suspenders bore the mark of a fatal accident, written in the unnatural angle of his neck. A young boy, no more than 10, reached out with hands that never quite seemed to touch anything solid. Ezekiel Thornfield stepped closer, his form more substantial now, as if Cornelius's acknowledgement had somehow anchored him more firmly to the visible world. "You're Jasper Brixton's son," he said with certainty. "You have his eyes, his way of sitting a horse. He used to stop here too, long before you were born. Talk to us like we were old friends." "My father could see you?" Cornelius asked, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "More than see, he understood our purpose. Every soul gathered here died with something left undone, some message undelivered. Your father carried our words to the living world when he could. He'd visit families in town, share what we asked him to share, never claimed the messages came from us, just said he'd remembered something important that needed saying." A middle-aged woman in a nurse's uniform from the 1940s stepped forward. "I'm Cordelia Ashworth," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I died in a blizzard trying to reach the Hendrickson cabin. Their little girl had the fever. I never made it, never knew if she survived. Your father found out for me years later, told me she grew up to become a doctor herself, saved hundreds of children. Knowing that, it eased something I'd carried for decades." More stories began to flow, each spirit eager to share their connection to Jasper Brixton. The logger had worried about his widow's financial security Jasper had quietly insured. She knew about the insurance policy her husband had hidden away. The young boy had been separated from his dog in the avalanche that claimed his life. Jasper had tracked down the animal and delivered it to the boy's surviving sister, where it lived out its days as a beloved family pet. He never told anyone about us directly, Ezekiel explained, just acted on the information we shared, making it seem like lucky coincidences or recovered memories. He knew the living world wasn't ready to accept our existence, but he also knew we deserved to have our concerns addressed. Cornelius felt a profound shift in his understanding of his father. All those mysterious trips to town, the unexpected visits to families Jasper claimed to have just remembered needing help, the way he'd sometimes return from their rides with a peaceful expression and no explanation for his mood. It all made sense now. After he died, the woman in calico said, "We hoped you might take his place. Each year you rode past, so focused on your grief that you couldn't hear our voices. We grew desperate, tried harder to reach you, but it only frightened your horse, until today," Ezekiel added with something approaching a smile. "Today something was different. Today you finally stopped to listen." Cornelius looked back at Maverick, who stood calm now, no longer trembling. The horse seemed to understand that the barrier between worlds had finally become permeable, that his rider could now perceive what he had always sensed in the animal's patient eyes. Cornelius saw not fear, but approval and perhaps relief that the burden of protecting his human from unseen forces could finally be shared. "What do you need from me?" Cornelius asked, the question emerging from a place deeper than conscious thought. The assembled spirits stirred with something that might have been hope. Around the scarred Douglas fir, the mist began to pulse with a gentle, rhythmic light, as if the tree itself was responding to his willingness to serve as a bridge between two worlds. Ezekiel Thornfield gestured toward a woman who had been standing quietly at the edge of the gathering. She wore a simple blue dress that might have been fashionable in the 1950s, and her hands were clasped tightly before her, as if she were struggling to contain some powerful emotion. "This is Beatrice Caldwell," Ezekiel said. "She's been waiting the longest to have her message delivered." Beatrice stepped forward, her form flickering like an old movie projected on mist. "I died in 1953, she said, her voice carrying the weight of 7 decades of unfinished business. "Car went off the road during an ice storm, right at Devil's Curve about 5 miles down the mountain. I was rushing to the hospital. My daughter Magnolia was having her first baby." Cornelius felt his heart tighten at the anguish in her voice. "You never got to meet your grandchild, never even knew if they both survived the birth." Beatrice replied, tears that couldn't quite form glistening in her ethereal eyes. "Magnolia would be in her 90s now, if she's still alive. The baby, my grandchild, would be nearly 70. I've wondered every day for 7 decades, did I have a grandson or granddaughter? Did they live good lives? Did Magnolia ever forgive me for not being there when she needed me most?" The depth of her pain was overwhelming. Cornelius could feel it radiating from her like heat from a fire, a mother's love transformed into an eternal ache by the cruel timing of death. Round them, the other spirits watched with expressions of understanding, each one carrying their own burden of unfinished love, unspoken words, undone deeds. "I can find out," Cornelius said simply. "I can find your family." Beatrice's form solidified for a moment, hope blazing across her features like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "You would do that? You would really try to find them?" "I promise," Cornelius replied, and felt the words bind him to something larger than himself. This was why his father had spent so many years making mysterious trips to town, carrying comfort to families who never knew the source of their unexpected peace. This was the true purpose of the annual rides, not just to remember the dead, but to serve them. Ezekiel nodded approvingly. "Your father made the same promise to each of us in turn." Some requests were simple, knowing that a loved one had recovered from illness, or that a financial worry had been resolved. Others required more effort, but he never failed to keep his word. "How did he do it?" Cornelius asked. "How did he find information about people from so long ago?" Carefully, Ezekiel replied with a knowing smile. "Libraries keep old newspapers. Churches maintain records. The elderly remember stories their parents told them. Your father had a gift for asking the right questions in the right places, making people comfortable enough to share their memories." Beatrice reached out as if to touch Cornelius's hand. her ghostly fingers passing through his flesh like cold mist. "If you could find Magnolia, or even just learn what happened to her, if you could tell me about my grandchild's life, I will," Cornelius said firmly, "but I need more information. What was your daughter's married name? Where exactly did she live?" "She married Bobby Hartwell just before I died. They lived in a little house on Maple Street in Cedar Falls. That's about 20 miles east of here. Bobby worked at the sawmill. And Magnolia, she wanted to be a teacher, always loved children, always said she wanted a big family." Cornelius committed every detail to memory, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like his father's old coat. This was more than a favor for a restless spirit. This was a sacred trust, a continuation of work that had been left unfinished when Jasper Brixton's heart stopped beating. "There's something else," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "In my car, when they found me, there was a bag of baby clothes I'd been knitting, blue and yellow, since we didn't know if it would be a boy or girl. I need to know, did someone save those clothes? Did they make it to my grandchild?" The specificity of her concern struck Cornelius with its poignant humanity. Even in death, she remained a grandmother worried about practical things, about the small gifts of love that might bridge the gap between generations. He understood now why his father had devoted so much time to these spirits. They weren't supernatural mysteries to be feared, but people whose stories deserved to be completed. Around them, the other souls watched with renewed hope. If Cornelius could fulfill Beatrice's request, perhaps their own messages might finally reach the world of the living. The scarred Douglas fir seemed to pulse with gentle approval, its ancient wisdom recognizing the continuation of a covenant between the living and the dead. 2 weeks later, Cornelius sat in the Cedar Falls Library, surrounded by boxes of old newspapers and city directories. The librarian, a patient woman named Mrs. Kowalski, had been more than helpful once he'd explained his interest in local history. What he hadn't explained was the true nature of his research, that he was hunting for traces of a woman who had died 70 years ago, on behalf of her spirit that still lingered at the threshold tree. The breakthrough came in a yellowed copy of the Cedar Falls Gazette from February 1954. The headline read, "Local woman dies in storm, daughter names baby in her honor." Cornelius's hands trembled as he read the article that followed. Magnolia Hartwell had indeed survived childbirth, delivering a healthy daughter just hours before learning of her mother's death. The baby had been named Beatrice Magnolia Hartwell, carrying forward both her grandmother's name and her mother's own. The article mentioned that Beatrice Caldwell had been rushing to the hospital with a bag of handmade baby clothes when her car skidded off. Devil's Curve, but the story didn't end with tragedy. Continued searching through the newspaper archives revealed more pieces of the Hartwell family saga. Young Beatrice had grown up to become exactly what her grandmother would have hoped to teach her, who specialized in working with disadvantaged children. She'd married a man named Fletcher Morrison and had 3 children of her own. The family had stayed in Cedar Falls, becoming pillars of the community. The most remarkable discovery came in a 1998 article about the retirement of Beatrice Morrison from her position as principal of Cedar Falls Elementary School. The piece mentioned that she kept a special display case in her office containing baby clothes. Her grandmother had been knitting when she dyed blue and yellow garments that had become family treasures, passed down through 3 generations of children. Cornelius felt tears sting his eyes as he read that passage. Not only had the clothes survived, but they had become cherished heirlooms, each grandchild and great-grandchild wearing them home from the hospital. Beatrice Caldwell's final gift had been treasured for 70 years, connecting her love to descendants she'd never met. Current records were easier to find. Magnolia had lived to be 96, passing away just 2 years ago. Beatrice Morrison, now 70, still lived in Cedar Falls, still volunteered at the elementary school. She had 4 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren, all living within 50 miles of where their ancestor had been born. Armed with this information, Cornelius made a decision that would have seemed impossible a month ago. He drove to Cedar Falls and knocked on Beatrice Morrison's door. She was a woman who radiated the same gentle strength he'd sensed in her grandmother's spirit. Her eyes were kind but sharp, and she welcomed him in with the grace of someone accustomed to unexpected visitors, a teacher's instinct that never really retired. "Mrs. Morrison," Cornelius began carefully, "I know this might sound strange, but I've been researching local history, and I came across the story of your grandmother, Beatrice Caldwell. I wondered if you'd be willing to tell me about her." The woman's face lit up with joy. "Oh my, no one's asked about Grandmabby in years. She died before I was born, you know, but she's always been such a presence in our family. Would you like some tea? I have so many stories to share." Over the next 2 hours, Cornelius learned that Beatrice Caldwell's legacy lived on in ways her spirit could never have imagined. The blue and yellow baby clothes were indeed family treasures, but they were just the beginning. Each generation had been raised on stories of the grandmother who died trying to be present for love, a woman whose final act of devotion had become the foundation of the family's values. "She would have been so proud," Beatrice Morrison said, showing Cornelius a wall of photographs spanning 7 decades. "Mom always said Grandmabby would have wanted us to stick together, to be there for each other no matter what. That's exactly what we've done." As Cornelius prepared to leave, Beatrice Morrison pressed something into his hands, a small photo of her mother, holding her as a newborn, both of them wearing pieces from the precious collection of blue and yellow clothes. "I don't know why you're really interested in our family history," she said with the knowing smile of a woman who'd spent decades reading between the lines of children's stories, "but I have a feeling Grandmabby would want you to have this." Driving back toward the mountains, Cornelius felt a profound sense of completion. He had more than information to share with Beatrice Caldwell's spirit. He had proof that love, once given, never truly dies. The next morning, Cornelius returned to the threshold tree with Maverick, his saddlebags heavy with more than just supplies. Tucked carefully in his jacket pocket was the photograph Beatrice Morrison had given him, along with printed copies of newspaper articles and family records that told the complete story of a grandmother's enduring love. Maverick approached the scarred Douglas fir without hesitation this time, his steps confident and purposeful. The horse seemed to understand that they were returning not as trespassers in a realm of mysteries, but as welcomed participants in an ancient ritual of connection between the living and the dead. The mist began to gather as soon as they reached the tree, swirling up from the forest floor like smoke from some invisible fire. But now Cornelius could see the beauty in it rather than feeling fear. This was sacred space, a place where love transcended the boundary of death. Beatrice Caldwell materialized first, her form more solid than before, as if his promise kept had somehow anchored her more firmly to the visible world. Behind her came Ezekiel Thornfield and the others, their expressions expectant but patient. They had waited 70 years. They could wait a few moments more. "Your daughter survived," Cornelius said without preamble, his voice carrying clearly through the mist-shrouded air. "Magnolia lived to be 96. She named her baby after you, Beatrice Magnolia Hartwell. Your granddaughter is now 70 years old, a retired teacher who spent her life helping children, just like her mother wanted to do." Beatrice's form blazed with light so brilliant that for a moment Cornelius had to shield his eyes. When he could look again, tears of pure joy were streaming down her ethereal face. "She lived," Beatrice whispered. "My baby lived and had a good life. More than good," Cornelius continued, pulling out the photograph. "She had 3 children of her own, and they had children. Your family tree now includes for generations of descendants, all living within 50 miles of where you were born. And the baby clothes," he paused, savoring the moment of revelation that would finally give this grandmother's heart the peace it had sought for 7 decades. "The baby clothes you were knitting survived the accident. They've been treasured family heirlooms for 70 years. Every child in your family has worn them home from the hospital. Your granddaughter, your great-grandchildren, your great-great-grandchildren. Your final gift of love has welcomed 7 babies into the world." Beatrice's form began to change, becoming translucent, as if she were dissolving into light itself. But her expression was one of profound peace, a weight lifted that had pressed upon her spirit for most of a century. "Thank you," she said, her voice already growing distant. "Thank you for letting me know that love finds a way." As Beatrice faded into whatever realm awaited souls at peace, the other spirits gathered closer. Cornelius understood that this was just the beginning. Each of them had their own unfinished business, their own messages that needed carrying to the world of the living. Like his father before him, he had inherited a sacred trust, a responsibility that would shape the rest of his life. Ezekiel Thornfield stepped forward, his expression grave but hopeful. "There are dozens of us here," he said, "and more arrive each year, people who die with something left undone, some word unspoken. Will you help them too?" Cornelius looked around at the assembled spirits, seeing them now not as frightening apparitions, but as people whose stories deserved completion. His father had spent 30 years carrying their messages to the living world. Now it was his turn to take up that work. "I will," he said solemnly. "I promise." As the mist began to clear, Cornelius mounted Maverick and continued their ride toward the old fire tower. But the annual pilgrimage had transformed into something far greater than a journey of personal grief. It had become a covenant between worlds, a bridge across the ultimate divide, a testament to the truth that love once given never really ends. Behind them, the scarred Douglas fir stood sentinel over sacred ground, its lightning-carved spiral seeming to pulse with gentle approval. The threshold tree would continue to mark the boundary between worlds, and Cornelius would continue to cross that boundary. Whenever the dead needed their voices carried to the living. It was, he realized, exactly the kind of work his father would have wanted him to do, the kind of work that made a life matter long after the heart stopped beating. And as Maverick carried him up the mountain trail, Cornelius felt his father's presence riding alongside them. Proud of the man his son had finally become, the annual ride would continue, but it would never again be a journey of solitary grief. It had become something far more beautiful, a celebration of the connections that bind us all, living and dead, in an endless chain of love that not even death could break.